Hello and welcome to the RACC IT Podcast. I'm Andrew McDowell, the founding director of Taurus Advisory, an London-based advisory business that helps clients identify opportunity and manage risk in markets around the world. Today I'm joined by Sophia Furber, Fintech research analyst at 451 Research, an S&P Global company, and an old friend and former colleague of mine. Sophia, thanks so much for joining. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And you're just back from Istanbul, I think, a place that we both know quite well, having actually met there almost 20 years ago when we were exploring the Middle East in our previous lives. Tell me a little bit about your trip, because it was a fintech-related one, wasn't it?
Yes, it was indeed. It was the Fintech Istanbul B2B Connect Summit. So it was a small fintech conference. There was about 600 people in attendance from across the Turkish fintech ecosystem. And I basically went to we've become very interested in fintech in the Turkish market. So it was just a great opportunity to kind of go and see what was what and meet some of the major players in that space.
And what particularly struck you during your visit there, other than the many cups of tea, I'm sure?
Well, many cups of tea for sure. I would say a lot of people associate Turkey first and foremost with huge kind of economic and political volatility, which is true. However, there are a number of fintechs that have managed to build and to scale and to become profitable and to even expand overseas despite all of that. And I was really interested in the stories of how these companies had kind of grown to what they were, despite all of the challenges and the headwinds that they'd faced. So there were some big names in the payment space, like CPay is one of them. We spoke quite a lot with them. We spoke to a number of companies providing various kind of tech solutions in the payments ecosystem, everything from kind of fraud screening and risk management to digital wallets that people can use on their mobile phone. And it was a lovely tour of the Turkish fintech industry. So it's a very diverse industry. I think Turkey has like a very, very mature banking market as well, which I think in many ways has been a springboard for the fintech industry. There is the capital, there is the tech there. So yeah, I think it's a very dynamic market. And I'm really happy that I got the opportunity to spend a few days immersing myself in it.
That's great. And other than those things you've highlighted, what other competitive advantages would you say Turkey has as an incubator for these fintechs? I mean, obviously, we know that Turkey has this talent pool too, and the very entrepreneurial environment, particularly in dynamic cities like Istanbul. What else struck you?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I have to say, reiterate the talent pool, because I think one thing that people don't always realise about Turkey, and I think Istanbul and Ankara in particular, is these are real regional centres of excellence for STEM subjects. I mean, you have people coming from all over the world, often from the global south, to study in Turkey. And so there's this fantastic talent pool there. And I think, as you said, combined with that sort of the Turkish entrepreneurial spirit, it's a fantastic combination. I mean, I think one thing that's also quite interesting is comparing it with fintechs in Western Europe. A lot of fintechs here, definitely in London, have grown thanks to VC funding. Now, in Turkey, there's a lot of kind of family money. A lot of companies are bootstrapped. So I think that's quite interesting as well, that their growth trajectory has been a bit different.
Got it. Thank you. And what do you think comes next for the Turkish fintech sector? I mean, there's going to be sort of international expansion, and how easy will they find it to break into new markets elsewhere in Europe?
Well, definitely international expansion on the cards for a lot of big players that we've spoken to.
And so you mentioned CPay. Could you tell me a little bit more about that business and any others that really stood out for you from the ones that you met?
Yeah, so CPay is mainly in the payment space. So they've got digital wallet. They've also got payment software for merchants of all kinds to accept payments, and a range of sort of financial sort of services to basically support the small and medium-sized business ecosystem.
Got it. And are there any particular niches other than payments that really stand out for you in Turkey?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say fraud prevention, KYC and identity management. You've got some really strong companies out there like OnLayer and ArcSigner. Those are two companies that are very, very international already.
Excellent. Well, it's really good to hear that Turkey is producing these businesses, because it's a country I think we've both had a lot of affection for and also a lot of respect for. Its economic success story, as you say, there's a lot of political noise around it, which is the sort of thing that Toros helps guide clients around. But it's always an impressive place to go to, and that entrepreneurial spirit that we've discussed. And I know a lot of Turkish people running businesses here who've had great success, and occasionally reprimand Brits for not being as hardworking as Turks. So it's perhaps a lesson to be learned there. Going back a bit, it'd be good to talk to the listeners a little bit about your career development, because we met doing research and writing about the Middle East and other emerging markets, and I think you studied English literature, and now you've ended up in the fintech space. Could you give me a quick potted biography of how you ended up where you are and the experiences that you've had?
Oh, goodness. Well, when I started out of university, I didn't even know that fintech was a thing, but here I am today. So my first job out of university was actually working with you at Oxford Business Group back in the day. I'm doing research on emerging markets. From there, I ended up taking a job working as an international observer in Nepal with the Carter Centre during the peace process. And then once that role was over, it was back to London, where I worked as a financial journalist for over a decade, then kind of fell in love with the fintech industry, and then had an opportunity to pivot from journalism to research. So here I am.
Excellent. And what is it that sort of gripped you about fintech particularly? Obviously, it's a very dynamic sector.
Oh, goodness. I think that fintech, it aims to solve a lot of social problems and bottlenecks that conventional banking hasn't managed to touch, whether it's providing services for small businesses or financially underserved people or people sending remittances. I think it's such a problem-solving industry, and I find that really, really interesting and really exciting. And also the people. I think you just meet some fantastic people in fintech with really diverse and interesting life stories. And there's just such a great energy in the sector. And I've sort of just found it really compelling from the get-go.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think when I started doing writing about tech, particularly in emerging markets and particularly in Africa, one thing that really stood out was the use of mobile money and how that was transformational. Obviously, Kenya was a leader there, and I wrote about it a bit in Ghana, but really making a difference to people's lives. And it's tech that we all use every day now in the UK and more people around the world. So I think that sort of facilitating payments is something that so clearly removes friction from people's lives, and as you say, is transformational. For example, in increasing financial inclusion, particularly in emerging markets that we've both worked on over the years. I'd be interested in hearing a bit about your views on how fintech is evolving currently in the UK, but also globally. What do you see as opportunities for investment, areas where there's still friction, where fintechs can help out, and a little bit about the sort of geographical diversity. We've talked a bit about Turkey. It'd be interesting to hear which other places are really up and coming in the fintech world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think fintech is not a new thing anymore. It's a pretty mature sector in the UK now. So we've got some of the neobanks like Monzo and Starling are, really kind of, they've really sort of earned their place in the financial services landscape. In terms of sort of pain points and bottlenecks that are still to be solved, I do think B2B fintech, so fintech providing services for small and medium enterprises in particular, is somewhere where there's still opportunity for disruption and innovation. I think that's really interesting, whether it's providing credit, whether it's providing ways to move money across borders. That's definitely exciting. I think fraud prevention as well, because there's a lot of fraud around, I think, and there's some fantastic fintechs out there who are trying to solve that problem. So that's interesting. And I think also fintechs that provide services that help banks to provide digital services and experiences, because banks can't do everything for themselves necessarily. So I think that's quite an exciting and dynamic area. In terms of geographies that are interesting, I mean, I have to say I'm a Brit, but I do truly think that like the UK has a very vibrant fintech ecosystem. I think we actually do have quite a good entrepreneurial culture here, and backed up by a very mature banking sector as well. Outside of the UK, I have to say India always, as India is such an exciting market at the moment. They've got, in terms of payments, the amount of change in the past decade has been extraordinary. Some of that's been somewhat driven by the government. They've had demonetizations. There's been a push to encourage people to make payments digitally. They've got the UPI, United Payments Interface. So they've got fantastic kind of comprehensive infrastructure for digital payments. And it's interesting to see how fintech and digital payments have become such a part of daily life in India. And they've got some incredibly smart people in that industry as well, techies, engineers, entrepreneurs. So it's a really vibrant and exciting space. I think, as a Brit can learn a lot from it.
Is there anything in particular that Brits can learn, you think, from India or other markets, whether it's in terms of regulation, whether it's in terms of entrepreneurial approach, whether it's in terms of particular product niches that we may be overlooking here in the UK?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I think, do you know what? I think good relations with the regulator are just a must wherever you're working. And I think one thing that the UK and India have got in common is that the regulators in both countries are very nurturing, actually, to fintech. And they do want to provide a regulatory framework that is going to encourage innovation. I say India, they've been really good, I think, pushing the envelope for digital services for SMEs because, as we know, India is a nation of small and medium enterprises. So I think that's been really good. And I think they've actually done a lot to work to lower the cost of remittances. That's partly through great tech, but also through smart partnerships across border. And I think we could probably do with doing more of the same in the UK. I think it's happening anyway, but India is turbocharged and it's very impressive to see.
That's very interesting. I think you see that more and more in India from my sort of limited knowledge, because it's not a place we do a huge amount of work, but the regulatory environment has improved so much over the past 20 years from the time when I was first started visiting. Well, that was almost 30 years ago, and just the approach to business and that nurturing approach that you've talked about, and before previously, the idea of there being rather sclerotic bureaucracy and regulation. But this is something where clearly the government has said this is something we need to support and nurture, as you say, and that unleashes that talent pool that India so clearly has. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about, well, we're talking geographies, about Central and Eastern Europe, which, as you know, is an area that I've focused in traditionally. And obviously, RACC IT has its links traditionally to Romania. And what's happening in fintech in Central and Eastern Europe, and which particular success stories do you see emerging from that geography?
Yeah, I mean, I think one that a lot of people in the UK will know very well is Fintech OS, which is a Romanian-founded fintech that is active across Europe, in the US and in the UK. And what they do is very cool. Basically, it's they provide kind of digital journeys and experiences for conventional banks and insurers and wealth managers. So that could be anything from, instant credit decisioning to having a really good chatbot or a really cool, really easy to use interface for a banking app. And they have a lot of pretty big names in financial services now as clients. They're very well known over here, and we know them pretty well, and we've been watching their journey now for a couple of years. So I think that's been quite a success story in the region. Yeah.
Excellent. And any others? I wrote some years ago, when pretty much I first heard of fintech over a decade ago, about Poland, and that was a place where there was quite a mature banking system, where banking really went from 0 to 100 in the 1990s, thanks again to a supportive regulatory framework, investments from international players. Are there any particular players from Poland, or any particular niches you see where Poland has made a success of itself?
Yeah, so there's one company you need to know about in Poland, but if you're interested in payments generally, you should know this name, which is BLIK. BLIK is the sort of local payment method of Poland. It is created by a consortium of Polish banks, and it is a mobile-based payment method. You can use it for paying your mates, you can use it for paying your plumber, but you can also use it to generate a code to get cash out of an ATM. You can use it for kind of online shopping, loyalty points, everything. So it's very comprehensive. And it's actually, from what I'm told, it's more popular than kind of the Apple Pay and Google Pay. And, those international wallets. Poland, this consortium of banks of BLIK have clearly just designed something that's very in tune with local tastes. And, user numbers are growing and growing. It's a real heavy hitter in that region.
That's great to hear. And that sort of dovetails with something we were talking about a bit earlier before we started recording, which is payments nationalism, I thought you called it. And we may not put BLIK in that category necessarily, but we are seeing sort of maybe an urge in the EU to nurture homegrown payment systems. We have a strong player coming from China in Alipay. What do you see in that trend of payments nationalism and an attempt to nurture homegrown players, both in the EU and in other geographies?
Yeah, this is something really interesting that we've been seeing for some years now in Europe. So yes, as you mentioned, I think there is some anxiety among regulators and politicians about the fact that we've got obviously two major US card networks who play a kind of outsized role in our payments landscape over here in Europe. Then you've obviously got the kind of big techs like PayPal and Google Pay and Apple Pay. Then there's Samsung Pay from Asia. Then obviously we've got Alipay making its presence felt. And I think there is that desire to have something that is homegrown. So I don't know if there are any sort of political issues or any of this infrastructure provided by foreign players were to fall over, that we actually have something our own in this side of the world. So a number of countries actually do have these local payment methods, which are digital wallets. There is something called the European Payments Initiative, which is a consortium of different banks from around Europe, which has been around in various incarnations over quite a long time now, probably nearly a decade. And they're trying to come up with a sort of pan-European digital wallet, which is going to be a rival to Visa and MasterCard. And they've tried a couple of things in the past that haven't quite taken off. The latest iteration is something called Wero, W-E-R-O. And that's live, I think, in Germany. And they've acquired a Dutch company called Ideal, I think Belgium as well. So it'd be very interesting to see how that one takes off.
Why haven't these initiatives taken off so far?
Because I think part of it is trying to do anything with a consortium is really tricky. So EPI had at some point a few years ago kind of lost various consortium members from around Europe who exited for various reasons. So I think that is part of it. I think the problem is also that the existing tech and infrastructure just works so well and the user experience is good. So why would you change it?
Yeah, I suppose that provides high barriers to entry to start off with, doesn't it? How do you see the open banking regulation evolving? I mean, my perception is that open banking regulation has been fairly transformative in powering fintechs and has been something that fintechs have been looking forward to the waves of deregulation. What next in open banking?
Do you know, it's interesting you should say that because I think it's a great thing and I think it is transformative. But a lot of people in the industry, definitely in the UK, feel that open banking hasn't quite reached its potential, especially as a payment method. Because as you know, with open banking, there's two things you can do with it. One is the account information piece where you can kind of analyze account data and customer data with permission, obviously. And the other one is initiating payments. And I think there are a lot of people who'd like to see it used more for payments, especially paying merchants online. But I think a lot of people in the industry feel we haven't quite cracked the user experience and user awareness piece.
Are there any jurisdictions where open banking is particularly advanced? Whether it's penetration being particularly high or it's really worked for the industry where there hasn't been that slight sense of a need to catch up that we have in the UK that you've described?
Yeah, the one, if we're going to look globally, it's Brazil. Brazil is like the runaway success story of open banking.
And why is that?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, maybe it was something that Brazil is difficult to say. It's a big population. I think a lot of it was probably policy driven from the government. I think the government really embraced it and the fintech industry really embraced it. And, clearly there were people out there providing some great user experiences for people who were managing their money from their phones and it's just exploded.
Very interesting. I think that touches on something we keep on coming back to, is the importance of having that regulatory framework and that policy making, understanding of the importance of fintech and open banking in driving things that most governments want, like greater financial inclusion and tech take-up. And this is something that we touch on with clients in various jurisdictions. What is the government doing? How supportive is the environment for tech? If we invest here, is it likely to be looked on favourably? What's going to happen with open banking regulation? And it's very interesting seeing the differences between jurisdictions. Moving on, something again that I think you're interested in, and something that I've touched on too in the past, is that relationship between banks and fintechs. And when I've looked on it in the past as a non-banking specialist and non-tech specialist, but who does a lot of work in both, there has been a sense that there's some tension. The fintechs are going to come and eat our lunch. They're so fast moving, but they don't really know banking. They don't have our established names. But I see from the outside of the industry more and more collaboration, and all banks all at least now claim to embrace fintech. How do you see that relationship evolving?
I think it's definitely come a long way. I'd say if we were having this conversation a decade ago, it would have been much more about, an adversarial relationship between banks and fintechs. Now I don't think that's the case. I think often we've got fintechs that are catering for niches that maybe traditional banks either haven't been able to look after that well, or maybe they don't want to engage with as much. Key example of that would actually be lending and financial services for SMEs. So we've got some really exciting sort of neobanks and fintechs such as Alaka Bank and Oak North that are doing some really great work in that segment. Then you've got a lot of fintechs, actually like Fintech OS, which are providing tech services that they're selling into banks. So it's a totally symbiotic relationship in some cases. One other thing I might add actually is if you look at the stats in the UK for account switching and who are the winners and the losers, there's not... The neobanks like Monzo and Starling, they are gaining users, for sure. But a lot of the movement of accounts and account signups is actually between the big banks. So if you look at who's net gained the most new customers, I think in the last year it was nationwide, so the big gains weren't necessarily coming from the neobanks. So I think that's just an interesting thing to maybe bear in mind.
So the big banks are still able to have their lunch?
Yeah, pretty much. They have to share it, but it's not being devoured by the fintechs.
That's it, Tim. Sometimes fintechs bring something to the table.
Absolutely. That's a great way of putting it.
Very interesting. Another area of that you mentioned a bit earlier about sort of the evolution of fintech is fraud and fraud prevention. What do you see developing on that front? And what are the risks and opportunities there? Speaking as someone who works in risks and opportunities in terms of investment, but also and opportunities to prevent fraud and who's doing particularly well, but also obviously keeping up with that evolving risk.
Oh, goodness. So, yeah, fraud. I mean, this has kind of been the dark side of the digital payments revolution. And it has also been the dark side of the AI boom, because a lot of varieties of fraud are actually AI enabled. So, for example, phishing scams and increasingly actually, voice calls and even video calls can be generated and spoofed by AI, which is quite terrifying. So there's whole new technologies which are enabling fraud, but also digital financial services, and people say not going into their bank for certain things, but doing them online has created whole new attack surfaces for fraudsters to target. So massive problem there for the industry. There's a certain type of fraud which is a real problem in the UK and a lot of Europe called APP fraud. So that's authorized push payment fraud. What that means is not that someone's hacked into your account, but that you've actually been tricked into authorizing a payment because you think someone asking for that money is a legit business or a family member, or, maybe even someone from your team who's asking you to initiate a payment for something. So massive problem. But the good news is there are some really interesting fintechs in the industry who are coming up, often with AI-powered solutions, actually to detect and stop fraud in its tracks.
Are there any particular ones that you'd like to highlight or any particular types of technology that you think are particularly impressive in tackling these things that are very scary, to me at least?
It's very, very scary and very alarming, but there are some smart people out there. There's a really cool one called Sion, who I think their founders might be of Hungarian descent. They're definitely causing waves. So they're using AI to detect suspicious patterns in transactions to sound an alarm that there may be fraud going on. So they're very interesting, very well respected, very, very young company. Who else is there? There's SumSub. There's an Estonian-based company called Verif that we've talked to quite a lot. There's some terrific fraud solutions actually coming out of the Baltic countries. There seems to be some great innovation there. So those are a couple of names that I put out there.
Excellent, thank you. And it doesn't surprise me that the Baltics are an area of excellence in this. We all know about Estonia's tech success story, but also having spent quite some time recently in Latvia and Lithuania. These are countries that really pride themselves in what they're doing in fintech. So fascinating to hear that also you have businesses from that part of the world that are on the fraud prevention side of fintech, which, as you've said, is increasingly crucial. Finally, looking forward a little, we've touched on these businesses. I suppose there's a tendency, maybe from my perspective, to look at startups in the tech industry. But something we've touched on in the past is, particularly now in the UK, you have fintechs that are very evolved companies that are now not even scale-ups. How do you see that shape of the industry evolving? Is there space still for newcomers, for startups? And what happens to those now quite mature fintechs?
Oh, great question. I mean, I think in terms of the startups, I'd say one thing I have noticed is I think it's quite difficult these days to start a B2C fintech. Now, it doesn't mean people aren't doing it, because they are. But my team and I were saying to each other the other day, we're not seeing that many new B2C fintechs coming up. And I'm wondering if that's because venture capital is a bit more limited than it used to be. Obviously there's like a regulation, especially around fraud prevention, are somewhat more onerous, and that's maybe harder for the newcomers to bear. Also B2C fintech. I mean, I don't want to say it's saturated, but it's definitely a busy market.
That's going to be my question. Saturated.
Yeah, because it's kind of at the stage where, we've seen quite a bit of M&A. I mean, I actually would have expected to see more M&A in Europe in B2C. Maybe there's more coming. Let's see. In terms of the bigger players, I mean, I guess there's one question everyone is asking is like, why aren't we seeing more IPOs? I think a lot of companies, because of global uncertainty, are sort of hitting pause on IPOs. I don't think it's a shame, because I guess there's institutional investors and capital don't get that exposure to the fintech market that an IPO could, be a conduit for. But yeah, in terms of like the fintechs that are already more mature, I think something that's quite interesting is like the movement of people who've worked in the banking sector ending up in those fintechs. So they're actually bringing a lot of institutional and technical expertise into that sector, and it's become a much more kind of well-worn career path, I think, rather than like, I'm leaving my job at like Lloyd's or NatWest and I'm going rogue. Now it's a much more kind of well-worn path.
And I suppose that will hopefully we'll see an uptick then in IPOs in the longer term and some M&A in the sector potentially.
Yeah, do you know what? Every year we say we're going to see more in M&A, and I always feel like we see a little bit less than I think there is going to be. But I think it's just global uncertainty. I think it's just a very difficult time for a lot of people to make decisions.
I mean, from our own experience, it seems that the M&A market, at least in Europe, is slightly becalmed. There's a bit less interest in tech companies that has been buoyant, particularly in CEE and in the UK that we've worked on in recent years. But certainly there seems to be at least a waiting and seeing atmosphere around the market. But with so many interesting companies now reaching that level where they're ready to be acquired, they're ready to merge and maybe do IPOs. Hopefully we'll see some more activity as that uncertainty dials down, whenever that may be. Sophia, thanks so much for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered about the outlook for the fintech sector, about things that particularly excite you? Because it's great to meet someone who's so enthused about this sector in which we do quite a lot of work, but would like to do more. And as you say, is very dynamic.
Oh goodness, a lot of things going on, but I would highlight stable coins. Watch out for stable coins. I'd say there are a number of big companies who are taking stablecoins very seriously and investing a lot in stablecoins as a means of doing cross-border payments in a efficient and cheap manner. So watch this space. I think there's some really interesting use cases from everything from sort of corporate treasury to, my favourite topic, remittances.
For a layman, could you just tell us, or at least me, what a stable coin is?
Yes, of course. So a stable coin is a kind of digital currency which is made up of a basket of other different currencies. It is designed so it's not as volatile as traditional cryptocurrency, which, as we all know, is notoriously volatile. And stable coins can be transacted on blockchain. And so that means there's like an immutable record of the transaction, but the transaction will also settle instantly. So this technically should solve some bottlenecks in cross-border payments, which involve often a lot of different actors. They can take a lot of time for transactions to clear and settle because of, banking systems actually aren't on 24/7. So, yeah, it's kind of like efficiency and security and speed is the kind of value proposition of the stablecoin, and also not as much volatility as crypto.
Quite understood. Thank you. And I suppose that leads me to a final question, which is there is space in fintech for crypto. Obviously, we've had a lot of volatility in recent years. There was a lot of excitement when Trump came in that Trump and Musk would unleash a crypto boom. That seems to have quietened down a little bit, though correct me if I'm wrong. What is the space for crypto other than stable coins and fintech? How will that relationship evolve over the next few years?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I will caveat this by saying that crypto is actually one part of the fintech market that I don't have that much expertise in. What I will say is we've seen kind of growing interest from institutional investors in cryptocurrency in recent years. It was kind of perceived as an inflation hedge. So, yeah, there's that kind of, I guess, like cryptocurrency being kind of tamed from being a sort of slightly wild out there asset into being something that institutional investors actually want to engage in. I guess the other thing with crypto is, looking at it from the perspective of countries where there is runaway inflation, or, maybe you have a central bank or a government that is not reliable. I think the general public do have an interest in using crypto as a means of storing wealth and moving value. And I think that is going to definitely be with us forever, I think.
Crypto is not dead yet. No, I didn't think it would be. And with increasing instability and uncertainty and rightly or wrongly mistrust of governments, I can imagine it will be here to stay.
I think yeah.
Sophia Furber, thank you so much for joining us on the RACC IT podcast. It's been great having you on. And I look forward to reading more of your work as the months go on, and hopefully in some more interesting transactions to come and success stories in this very interesting sector.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.